Fallout is one of the gaming universes that has incredibly deep lore. The Vault Tech programs are some of the most interesting pieces of gaming canon ever written. Some of these Vault's experiments would make some of the largest war crimes of the modern era blush, and today on Poseidon Films we wanted to go over some of the most insane Vault experiments that exist within the Fallout universe. If you like Fallout lore videos like this, be sure to press the like button. Vault 95 started with what sounds like good intentions. It was a vault designed to help those with chemical addictions get clean after the bombs fell. It was thought to be an experiment in if addicts would be able to get clean when left with no alternative. After all, it is impossible to get in touch with your supplier when he had been vaporized on the surface. This sounds like Vault Tech supporting a noble cause where they would help understand the science behind helping those with addiction. But with anything in this universe, there was a dark twist waiting. At first, the addicts really did come together and exceed expectations when it came to having a cohesive society underground. They elected an overseer on a yearly basis, and all members of the Vault had to participate in daily accountability meetings to discuss overcoming their addictions. At first, overcoming addiction was hard within the Vault, but over the course of 5 years, the Vault members progressed on their journey of sobriety, becoming better at contributing to the overall function of the Vault. The researchers in charge of gathering data even noted that the survivors had created family-like bonds with one another, and that their accountability systems made sure everyone contributed to the Vault's survival. The twist came when the researchers decided to open a secret trove of chemicals within the Vault. It was supposed to test if after 5 years, the addicts had truly overcome their addiction. The lead researcher waited until all the residents were asleep and then opened the cache. He hoped that they were able to stay away from the substances since they had created a good society. But as the old saying goes, never give an addict what they're addicted to. The stored case of the drugs destroyed the bonds that had been created within the community. Soon those who had been friends were stabbing each other in the back just for the chance to make a bigger score. Some of the residents immediately went back to their addiction in full force, using anything they could get their hands on. The mixture of this and those who had sworn to sobriety quickly exploded into violence, with people on either side of the conflict losing their lives in the immediate aftermath. The longer the violence went on, the more it appeared that holding out from using any substances would be impossible. Even the most devout to their sobriety eventually succumbed to the sheer despair of the situation and began using once again. The researchers were shocked by how quickly the reveal of the substances had completely destroyed the Vault and resulted in mass violence. They knew it was a possibility, but the scale had been nothing they would have expected. Only one member of the Vault was aware enough to realize that this entire situation had been set up intentionally by Vault Tech. The other were too consumed with either the chemicals or the chaos to give it much thought. As the Vault descended into anarchy, the violence consumed more lives on all sides of the conflict. Soon, the Vault was nothing but a skeleton crew of addicts working their way through the supply they had been given. Sticking with a similar theme of substances being used on unsuspecting Vault dwellers, the next Vault I want to discuss is Vault 106. Imagine you and your family were on the surface when the bombs dropped. Thankfully, you had invested in a spot in the vaults, so you rushed to safety and watched the Vault door close. Maybe you feel secure for a moment and start looking around at your fellow Vault dwellers, realizing these people were going to be your new underground family. Well, Vault Tech had some different plans for you. Vault 106 was a pretty straightforward yet messed up premise. How would people react to secret doses of psychoactive substances? Almost immediately upon the vault being sealed, the researchers began to release psychoactive chemicals into the air and onto objects without telling any of the residents. The overseer even went as far to gaslight the affected dwellers when they would come to him complaining of the effects they were feeling from the substances. Obviously, this made many of them feel even more insane than they did previously. While these substances may have caused a bad day or even a bad week originally, the effects were exacerbated by the fact the Vault team was continuously dosing them. There was never a time to come down and sober up. It was like a constant 24-hour trip. Over time, this began to seriously drive people insane. They became disoriented, acting like zombies stumbling around the hallways. Eventually, this disorientation shifted into a form of violence, with the dosed dwellers having a zombie-like ability to absorb damage and attack security personnel. The overseer tried in vain to put a lockdown in place, but as the drugs continued to be pumped into the air, the horde outside continued to grow in strength, eventually destroying all of the security in its path. At this point, they had taken over the Vault, but none of them were in the right mind enough to sustain the Vault society. Farming began to break down and violence continued to run rampant as food supplies dwindled. Eventually, it got to a point where only the most hardened, dangerous, insane dwellers remained within the vault. The entire time this was taking place, the substances were still filtering through the air filtration system, adding to their insanity. Anyone who ventures into 106 begins to have hallucinations almost immediately. And since the remaining population is insane, they also have to deal with the not-so-helpful residents, alongside seeing all of the violence that has been committed in the Vault's history. I guess the one good thing about this Vault experiment is that most of the population had no idea they were going insane. They just woke up one day under the influence that progressed from there. While some Vaults have been completely wiped out, this one still has zombie-like dwellers roaming around. My one question is what Vault Tech expected to get out of this experiment. I think anyone could have told you continuously dosing people with hallucinogens would drive them insane over time. I'm not a scientist in the 2200s, but even I could have predicted this outcome. Vault 11 is evil in more of a psychological torture kind of way, rather than the straight-up causing chaos way. Vault 11 was located in the Mojave Desert, and after it was sealed, it made the inhabitants aware that they were going to have to sacrifice one member of the Vault every year. Obviously, this made everyone extremely nervous, and since their lives had just been uprooted due to the end of the world as they know it, they didn't really take time to question it too much. They just assumed it was a cruel fact of their new reality. The Vault dwellers established a system where an overseer would be elected by democratic vote once a year, and after the end of their term. Well, let's just say things got uncomfortable for the overseer. The residents felt that the overseer who had led them into the Vault had been aware of this tragic situation, so they found it fitting for him to be the first sacrifice to the Vault. For the next decade and a half, life went on this model. Once a year, someone would be elected to overseer and have to perform their duties knowing that death awaited them. Over that time, certain political parties began to pop up and try to sway elections one way or the other. Of the 6 main political parties in the Vault, they would each campaign for one person to be elected to certain doom. As you went about your Vault duties, you could see posters of yourself basically campaigning for you to meet your demise. This led to a very tense feeling with everyone in the Vault. No one trusted each other, and you could forget any open and honest communication about anything. At one point, there was a situation where one of the more powerful party leaders propositioned a dweller under threat of putting her husband as overseer if she refused. She accepted under this threat, only for him to betray her and elect him as overseer anyways. In a rage, this woman struck down every last member of his political party and then was elected as overseer by the rest of the Vault. The party leaders who had most of their influence tied up in the elections didn't like this one bit, but when she proceeded to announce the new sacrifices would be selected at random, not through an election, they decided to stage a coup. The coup was a flurry of violence that ultimately spelled doom for the inhabitants, with most of them being wiped out in the small-scale civil war that was occurring under the ground. As the violence settled, the Vault was left with just 5 inhabitants. At this point, the 5 people left had nothing to live for. Their entire society, family structures, friendships, and sustainability had just been destroyed. They decided to put aside their differences and confront the Vault computer for making them behave like animals. Imagine their shock when the computer spit out a statement saying they had done a great thing by refusing and would be rewarded for their reverence of human life. You see, the entire thing had been an experiment. At any point over those 16 years, the Vault could have refused to sacrifice someone, and the computer would have given them a congratulations for showing how much they valued human life. Vault Tech was wondering how long a society would go on sacrificing its own before they simply refused, as a test of how much the inhabitants value human life in a post-apocalyptic situation. The 5 survivors were left flabbergasted as the computer continued to pat them on the back for their valuing of life. As they looked around at the rest of the destroyed Vault, they couldn't help but feel like life was playing a cruel joke on them. 4 of the remaining 5 survivors decided that they couldn't go on after all the violence that had occurred for no reason and ended their journeys at that moment. One survivor decided to leave the Vault and spread word of what had occurred in the Vault to assure that no one ended up making the same mistake again. Either way, the Vault's experiment proved to be the downfall of what could have potentially been a stable colony preserving human life. Vault 75 was truly a horrific Vault that seems cartoonish in its level of brutality. Placed under a middle school, its advertised purpose was to be a safe location for all the kids and their families in the event of a war. When the bombs fell, the children and their families piled into the Vault, only for the adults and children to be separated. The children were taken to their atrium and told their parents were being moved to another vault for orientation on Vault-Tec procedures. In reality, the security staff simply took out every single parent in the vault. From there, the children were bombarded with propaganda about how brutal the surface world was and how nothing up there was anything but evil. They were told they were training in the vault to be the heroes of the world and bring civilization back to the surface. In order to do this, they went through intense physical, mental, and emotional training to try to turn them into super specimens. The training was so intense that some children actually passed away during their exercise regimen. As this continued, they were told all of this would culminate on the day they turned 18. When they turned 18, they were separated into 3 groups. The first group was those who were supremely intelligent and physically gifted, basically the types you would want roaming the wasteland trying to help people. This group was sedated and then had their organs harvested by Vault-Tec for future cloning and research purposes. Those genes were just too good to waste on one person. The second group, who were intelligent but weren't strong and tended to be more obedient, were added to the Vault's research team. The third group, that wasn't really good at either side, was simply dealt with the same way their parents were. As this system went on for a short period, the scientists who had at one point been subjects of the test began to feel moral quandaries about doing the experiments. After all, they knew how tortuous the process could be, and they knew what fate awaited most of those in the class. At some point, they staged a rebellion with the junior subjects and the research staff that had graduated the program and took over the vault from the older research team. Once they had secured the vault, they decided the memories of the torture and death within the walls was too much to rebuild in. So they opened the vault and they decided to take their chances establishing a settlement out in the wasteland they thought they had been training to conquer. Not much is known about the fate of this group that decided to venture out into the wasteland, but I'm sure after generations of that process occurring over and over, there was no way to stay in the vault while also hanging on to your sanity. This is another one where Vault-Tec just adds layers of evil they really could have only thought of if they were purposely being sadistic. Vault 92 was originally supposed to be the vault where most of the world premiere musical talent would ride out the apocalypse. The vault had gathered the nation's finest musicians, singers, writers, and producers and put them in one location. They provided lots of sound and music equipment that would allow them to produce tons of new tunes to keep the vaults entertained for all of eternity. There obviously was a secret dark side to the experiment. You see, Vault-Tec had been experimenting with implementing white noise machines that could suggest action subconsciously to individuals enough to have them carry it out. They had placed this technology into the recording studios and they began experimenting on making individuals have controllable desires through the white noise machines. As musicians would be playing in their sound booths, they would be hit with an unnoticeable suggestion that they should commit an action of some sort on someone else in the vault. The only sign anything was off to people in the vault was some weird noises every now and then, but considering the amount of sound equipment, this wasn't really surprising. As the experiment played out, certain relationships were destroyed, while others flourished. It was strange how they would use the suggestions to purposely break up couples and form new ones they thought would be better for the success of the vault. As phase 1 of the experiment was showing success, they decided to engage in phase 2. This meant they started to play the white noise constantly throughout the entire vault 24/7. To help aid in this, the overseer banned the use of any personal sound equipment or earbuds, and this is when things really went off the rails. What the scientists slowly found is that the white noise would put the vault dwellers into a trance-like state, and when in this trance, they would do anything suggested to them 99% of the time. The scientists thought they had found the secret to effective mind control, which could be great for taking over the wasteland outside. But the longer the people were exposed to this white noise, the more things started to get violent. Certain musicians started to go insane from the constant exposure. They went on to go into fits of rage where they had near superpowers. One man went on a rampage taking out 3 other vault dwellers and needing to be hit 23 times by security before finally ending his rampage. More and more vault dwellers began to fall into psychosis because of their constant exposure to the noise. It was breaking down their brain function and turning them into super strong, brainless creatures that were prone to outbursts of violence. The violence got so bad that the researchers began to beg the overseer to call off the experiment so that things could return to normal, but the overseer refused. Slowly, up to 30% of the vault was classified as insane, and there was no way to contain this powder keg forever. Slowly, the inhabitants who had been turned into mindless, super strong zombies took out the security and began to overtake the vault. There was nothing the overseer could do to prevent them from having control. One dweller was able to take out the overseer and stop the experiment, but by that point, half the population and the entire maintenance crew had perished. With no one remaining to help take care of the vault, it slowly fell into a state of disrepair. The lower levels were completely flooded due to an underground lake nearby. The only thing left in the vault now is just the signs of violence and abandonment from those who had once lived there. Vault 51 was a vault with an unusual twist. Its overseer wasn't a human, but rather a supercomputer who was tasked with finding the best system of governance. At first, it decided to take the suggestion of allowing open elections like a democracy, but the first attempt at an election failed due to infighting and everyone voting for themselves. The computer allowed them to attempt an election again, but as the republic form of government continued to yield poor results, the computer eventually decided that it would be changing the governance to something more effective. Unfortunately, at this same time, it overheard a dweller saying that leaders present themselves in times of crisis, and decided it would cause enough crises to find plenty of leaders within the vault. There began to be outbursts of political violence, and the supercomputer looking to create a crisis started to purposely flare up the tensions in these situations to try to find a leader. One of his ideas was to move the richer members of the vault into cramped conditions, which caused one of them to try to blow his way out of the vault. He only took himself out in the explosion, but he would not be the last to lose his mind in the clutches of the vault. The computer continued to manufacture emergencies, thinking it would drum up a surge in capable leaders. It began to craft more and more dangerous situations that would put people's lives in serious jeopardy. When just outbursts of violence wasn't enough, it also manufactured a food crisis to push the inhabitants to their absolute limits. As the Vault members realized that the computer was ultimately in charge, they began to worship it as a god. The violence ramped up more, and in 1 month, 3 Vault dwellers would lose their life to random attacks. The computer began to play subtle noises that were designed to place people in an agitated state and increase their willingness to fight. Another Vault dweller would be attacked and thrown from a balcony, and at this point, one woman called for all of the Vault dwellers to set aside their problems and come together to stop this chaos. The computer didn't care that someone was trying to take charge at this point and continued to ramp up tensions between inhabitants. One resident even tried to attack everyone while they were gathered in the cafeteria but was stopped by security. It then began to mess with everyone's sleep patterns by randomly activating the alarms in the middle of the night to make sure no one was well rested. All of these things were stacking up to be a potential explosion of tensions that would destroy everything with the computer included. More and more inhabitants dropped like flies, culminating in an all-out brawl where only one man was left uninjured at the end. That man proceeded to take out everyone in the vault and was left as the sole inhabitant of Vault 51. The computer wasn't thrilled at the specimen that was left in front of him, and now turned his attention to making it as hard as possible for the remaining survivor to use anything in the vault. This turned him slowly into an alcoholic, and he accepted that the computer would always have total power and control over his life. When the vault opened in 2102, the desperate man tried to hack into the computer and ship himself out of the vault in a shipping crate. At some point, while trying to re-enter the vault, he discovered something truly horrifying. The computer system was not completely automated as he had thought. This meant that another human had been making the choices that had totally destroyed the vault with violence. Vault 87 began as a pretty standard vault. Honestly, there weren't plans to do anything too tortuous to the population. In 2076, their plans changed to include using the inhabitants of the vault as guinea pigs for the forced evolutionary virus on humans. Upon injection of the virus, both men and women lost all desire to reproduce naturally. The men gained serious upper body strength, and both received thicker, more durable skin 10 days after infection. It forces the infected to pretty much lose their identity as they slowly transform into a super mutant. As the infection takes over their brain, they lose a lot of the cognitive functions that make them human. The overseer and his security team just made observations as these people slowly lost their humanity and were transformed into some of the most fearsome creatures in the wasteland. Those they had once called friends were treated like rats in a science experiment, and it was a testament to Vault Tech's ruthlessness. As the days ticked on, the brain function of the infected inhabitants severely declined, and one of the female dwellers ended up passing away due to loss of brain function. All of the test subjects had to be terminated after 14 days due to their drastic increase in rage towards the researchers. The overseer had thought his security protocol was enough to keep these newborn mutants at bay, but neither him or security was prepared for them to organize. 1 year after their experimentation began, some of the test subjects managed to break free and took out the security forces. They now control the Vault and continue to turn standard humans into super mutants as a way to spread their kind across the wasteland. They send out teams of super mutants for miles to kidnap humans and bring them to the Vault for mutation. The mutants know how to do the augmentation, but they aren't exceptionally bright outside of that. So their Vault has become a blend of high-tech engineering and super mutant makeshift repairs. The Vault exists in its current state until the events of Fallout 3. People from around the capital wasteland cower in fear at the idea that they may be kidnapped in the night by super mutants, being forced to undergo the same experimentation Vault tech once carried out on the dwellers themselves. Once they become super mutants, they forget their pain, desires, and life from before, becoming half-intelligent drones with one mission on their mind, turning more of us into them. Vault 94 is a testament to how much society changed after the events of the Great War. Vault 94 was an experiment in how peaceful groups would do in a post-apocalyptic setting. It was filled with the members of a church that had serious convictions about non-violence. They were pacifists to their core and wanted nothing more than to help the world and focus on their agriculture. The Vault decided to not be run by an overseer and instead was controlled by a council. When the Great War started, it took some time for all the members of this community to get to the Vault. One half arrived early and was waiting on the second bus of survivors. Unfortunately, there was a short in the Vault door system and it closed prematurely, with only half of the planned survivors being able to enter the Vault before it closed. This was a shock to everyone, but they persisted knowing their pacifist ways would be key to maintaining society on the surface in the future. While most vaults had planned to be sealed for hundreds of years, this vault was known to only be sealed for a single year. This was not enough time for them to stray from their ideals, and the experiment was to see how they would fare in an immediate post-apocalyptic scenario. The group really did believe that their pacifism was going to fare well in the wasteland, thinking people would cling to anything that was safe and provided structure. As the year drew to a close, one vault dweller decided to raise concerns about security. With the opening coming so soon, he knew that there was no way the surface world was going to be in a peaceful state. This group, with its pacifist methods, were going to be eaten alive by the people on the surface. The council chastised him for his negativity and reminded him of the community's ideals. They decided to send out teams of ambassadors to try to meet survivors and bring them back to the Vault to join their peaceful society. The ambassadors strode out into the wasteland, expecting to have success with recruiting for the Vault to begin rebuilding society. The man who had issued the warning was right. After just 1 year from the Great War, the society was at its peak of chaos. Gangs of raiders ruled the streets, and the other survivors had learned not to trust anyone, no matter what they claimed their intentions are. Most of the ambassadors found themselves tortured by raiders and hung up as decorations in their dens. One ambassador had made his way to Harper's Ferry and quickly told everyone about his vault that had endless food supplies and an ability to establish a farm for the town. The mayor sent an expedition party to investigate the claims, and they arrived at the vault and met the pacifist they had heard so much about. The party thought there was no way anyone could be so naive and stupid in the post-Great War world and refused to stop at weapons check upon entry. During their meeting with the council, they were so thrown off and suspicious by their attempts to resolve everything by peaceful means, they swore they had walked into a trap. They then proceeded to massacre the council, thinking the entire vault was a ploy to lure in trusting wastelanders and terminate them. The wastelanders eventually gained access to a locked-off wing of the building that contained nuclear generators. The survivors thought this wing had contained a mind control device and proceeded to attack it to prevent it from falling into the raiders' hands. They did manage to destroy the device, but in the process triggered a nuclear meltdown and explosion that decimated everything in a 5-mile radius. Everything left in the radius was left severely mutated, and the area is one of the most dangerous in the region due to its high levels of radiation. Vault 12 was built under the armpit of a town, Bakersfield, California. It was supposed to be one of the most luxurious vaults ever constructed. It was able to purify sewer water back into drinking water, and was supposed to have an agricultural system that could support a massive population. All people who were slated to enter the vault went above and beyond when it came to preparedness and training. Unknown to all of the inhabitants of the vault, they were going to be subject to an experiment on radiation damage to the human body. Vault Tech had programmed the vault doors to never close, even after the bombs fell in the Great War. This meant that everyone would be exposed to massive levels of radiation and be left to fight whatever creatures and survivors were left out in the wasteland. After the Great War, it didn't take long for word to spread that all of the other vault doors had been sealed. Survivors from across the area poured into Bakersfield hoping to find supplies and take shelter in the vault to protect their own families from the tortures of the wasteland. Those who were in the vault were exposed to huge levels of radiation as they had been exposed to several explosions of the Great War. All of the population had underwent intense ghoulification, and in the year 2083 they would leave the vault for the first time. Some of the most diehards stayed behind and founded the ghoul capital of the Fallout world, Necropolis. Necropolis was led by a ruthless ghoul king named Set. He would rule over Necropolis for the next 73 years with an iron fist. He would expel and execute the more peaceful ghouls that remained in the city, quickly turning it into a hotbed for violence. It also was damaging the ghouls' reputation across the wasteland. The more violent Necropolis became, the more likely peaceful ghouls would be attacked on sight when dealing with other survivors. Visitors to the city were often eaten immediately, and humans began to avoid the city for the destroyed, blighted place it was. Eventually, the city would come under siege from super mutants, and while Set would manage to negotiate a ceasefire, it cost him his total control of the city. Eventually, the city would fall and cause the ghouls to scatter, but it left its mark in legends still told across the wasteland to this day. Vault 22 started off inhabited by scientists that were studying how to make crops more stable and allow the new world to not have the food security issues the pre-war world did. They researched things like fertilizers, crop production, and resistance to disease. At first, the Vault had great success with their research and soon found themselves with an abundance of food for their population. Things were great, and the researchers began to have more time to focus on their plant-based research they felt was important. Some of the samples they had before the war included fungi. One of these fungi was supposed to be great at pest control. When pests were exposed to the fungi, it would neutralize the brain and slowly take over the host before it would wither away and no longer be a threat to the plants. The fungal colony takes over the body at this point and uses it to feed itself and continue the production of its growth. They found out eventually it would turn the pests into a sort of moving host, taking over all motor functions like some type of zombie. The scientists began to experiment with the fungi, and it wasn't long until it was able to infect human hosts alongside your traditional pests. The Vault slowly became affected one by one as the experiments continued. Since humans were much larger than any pest, the symptoms wouldn't show for an extended period, and by the time anyone would notice, it would be way too late to do anything to reverse its effects. It started a pneumonia before eventually spreading through the body and slowly taking over the host. Once the fungus took control, the host became a hyper-aggressive super spreader that would attack anyone without an infection. The fungus was also resistant to all available treatments, and it spread through the Vault incredibly quickly. Scientists tried to incinerate the lower levels of the lab, but it wasn't enough to stop the spread, and soon all remaining inhabitants had been infected. By 2096, the Vault had been completely abandoned. Anyone left was consumed by the fungus. The few remaining survivors eventually made it to Zion Canyon, where they would eventually dissipate or succumb to the terrors of the wasteland. Vault 29 is a bit of a mystery. Not much is known about the results of the experiment or what exactly the current state of its inhabitants was. However, based on the premise, this truly might be the more terrifying vault of them all. A small maintenance crew consisting of janitors, mechanics, and medical personnel were assigned to the vault. These people were adults who were expected to keep the vault somewhat operational, while society totally fell apart. The only problem was, all of the other inhabitants of the vault were not going to be adults, rather an array of children under the age of 15. This would be enough of a challenge to manage this many children, but they also happened to be children of some of the most elite families in the world. Coming from such wealth, they had become accustomed to a life of luxury and excess, neither of which were going to be anywhere near as abundant in the vault. The experiment was to see if they could overcome their privileged upbringing and actually come together to make somewhat of a cohesive society. While not much is known of the results, I'm sure we can all agree the idea of posh children ever breaking out of their entitled ways is slim to none. Combine this with the Vault staff being able to put up with the torrent of abuse they would sustain, and I think this one probably fell apart pretty early. That is the tale of 11 vaults within the Fallout universe. This is my first attempt at doing a lore video. If you guys enjoyed it and want more, be sure to press the like button and comment so I know you guys would love to see more. If you have any suggestions of things I could have done to have made this video a more pleasant watching experience, please let me know in the comment section. I am always open to getting feedback that will help the channel grow. I am trying to hit 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I would greatly appreciate your support on the journey. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to check out the one on screen now about the upcoming Gaming Olympics. It's a pretty cool look into how the new event will impact gaming around the world.